The Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment has embarked on a mission to encourage individuals to exit the captive lion industry. Details about this project was published in the Government Gazette of 14 November 2024. However, Wildlife Ranching South Africa is deeply concerned that the government's plans will devastate not only the animals kept in captivity, but the private lion industry in general. Richard York, CEO of Wildlife Ranching South Africa, joins us now to discuss this matter. Good day, Richard. First of all, what is the difference between a captive lion and a wild lion?
So in South Africa, we've got what we call the Biodiversity Management Plan for lions. And we've got three distinct categories for lions in South Africa. We've got our wild lions. Those are your lions in your big national parks, such as Kruger National Park and Etosha. And then you've got your managed lions. And the managed lions are lions in the reserves that are smaller than 100,000 hectares. And the IUCN defines conservation status as being a conservation valuable species if they're in an area of 100,000 hectares and more. So we developed a management plan, which was our biodiversity management plan, to make sure that all the smaller reserves under 100,000 hectares are managed correctly to then contribute as one meta population, as a wild population in South Africa. Within the captive lions, we've also got two categories that most people are not aware about. We've got the commercial lions, that's the farmers, and then we've also got our lion sanctuaries, which are more dependent on donations than on the actual economic benefits from the lions themselves. And taking a step back, if we talk about the Biodiversity Management Plan, it's an extensive document that was developed in 2015. And its vision was, and I'd like to quote from my laptop, through the existence of stable, viable, and ecologically functional populations of wild and managed wild lions, along with well-managed captive populations that have minimal negative conservation impacts, lions will provide key opportunities for biodiversity conservation, economic development, social benefit, and improved management capacity. Now, this report went on to say that some of the sub-objectives must be, in terms of broadening the conservation context, is one, to maintain the current degree of protection of wild lions, reassess the status of lions in South Africa, enhance the conservation status of managed wild lions, and assess the management of the captive lion population. And in this document back in 2015, they set 5 goals to say that we must develop a national standard for the captive keeping and breeding of lions, execute an audit of lion keeping facilities and checking permit compliance, introduce a mandatory marking of captive bred lions, to create and maintain a database of permitted lion keepers, breeders, and DNA profiles, and to conduct a study to determine the contribution of the captive lion industry. They said that this status and this plan must be implemented within the next 5 years, and that these standards are to be developed and implemented. And this plan goes on to say, by 2019, all permit holders that do not comply with the minimum standards be closed down permanently. So we've already had a process that was supposed to be in place and implemented by 2019, and that process has never been implemented. We're now 5 years later. Now all of a sudden we've got 2 gazettes that are out for public comment. The first one, as you rightly mentioned, is to do about the voluntary exit and surrender of lion derivatives that are legally owned. We're not even talking about illegal products here, we're talking about legal products. And secondly, the other gazette that's out for public comment is to say that no new entrants to the market. And if we can use this example, so we've got this well-being concern that everyone's got about the captive lion industry. So what we're saying is we're going to shut down the road because the road's full of potholes and it's a welfare or well-being concern, and we're not going to allow any new cars on this road. But all the cars that are already on the road, please proceed. Carry on doing what you're doing. We're not going to address any of those problems. That's illogical. Surely you've got to fix the potholes to fix the road. You can't just shut down the road and say, now we fixed it. And that seems to be the trend that government's taking with this new gazette.
Do you know why the government has changed their mind in such a drastic way?
I think one of the biggest challenges that the government sits with is that they're ill-informed and that they themselves do not have the capacity. It has been cited because this biodiversity management plan was out on tender last year. And we've asked on numerous occasions, I actually sent several emails in the last week saying we were promised as industry that a report on the performance of the tasks and objectives of this report would be made available to us. We're yet to see that report. Similarly, the tender process highlighted to say that government has failed to implement this process effectively due to budget and capacity constraints. So now our department's rather taking a situation, instead of them doing their work and putting standards in place, putting record keeping in place, putting systems in place to monitor compliance, they're now saying let's rather shut down the whole industry because it's a lot easier for them to do so because of the external pressure. South Africa as a wildlife economy rich business gets a lot of external pressure to say shut down our industry because people don't understand that if you don't create wealth from wildlife, you don't have conservation areas outside of protected areas.
So let's for a second go to a point where industry goes along with government. How many lions will be impacted and what will be the implication for the individual lions? What will happen to them?
So we're sitting with a unique situation. The figures out there at the moment are contrasting. The high-level panel report identified between 8,000 and 12,000 lions in private ownership. The most recent ministerial task team report came out at slightly less. And there's been a lot of investigation on what these impacts are. Now, something that most people are not aware is that the NSPCA actually between 2015 and 2017 went to 113 facilities over that period. And they've visited these facilities that housed over 3,071 lions. Now, what was interesting for us is that after comparing their annual reports, we could find no reference to a single case where the NSPCA actually laid a formal charge against any one of these facilities for welfare concerns. Until now, their 2023 annual report, and I'd like to read the following 3 sentences for you on page 37 states. Major victory for South Africa's lions. The National Council of SPCA celebrated a major victory for lions in the country's first successful case against the cruelty and negligent confinement of these wild animals. The individual from Stalefontein Farm was charged with 7 different counts of contraventions of the Animal Protection Act 71 of 1962, including failure to provide sufficient and adequate shelter against all elements, provide portable water for all times, provide hygienic living conditions, provide sufficient space for the animals in his care, which include lions, tigers, caracal, serval, Cape foxes, and chickens. Initiating legal proceedings in June 2022, the case concluded on 30 August 2023, where the court found the accused guilty of contravening the act. The court sentenced the accused to a fine of 4,000 rand or 12 months imprisonment, which sentence was wholly suspended for 5 years. So if we've got this huge welfare concern, why is the NSPCA falling so completely short in proving it? Where's the facts? Where's the figures? Because what people don't realize, if I want to be commercially viable as a business, be it any form of agricultural or livestock business, if the welfare of my animals is not in good condition, I haven't got production. And if I haven't got production, I'm not economically viable. If I'm not economically viable, I'm out of business. So this whole welfare narrative that's been pushed so heavily in the media is nothing more than emotional exploitation of well-meaning people outside there to benefit financially through the various sanctuaries.
Is there a code of best practices out there for lion keeping?
Absolutely. So part of that whole biodiversity management plan that was addressed in 2015 said that there must be a code of best practice developed. Government never developed it. The private industry developed it. I'm aware of both SAPA, the South African Professional Predators Association, developed a code of best practice for their members. I'm aware of the Professional Hunters, FASA, that also developed a code of best practice for the hunting of these species. Both codes have never been accepted by government, despite government themselves never developing anything.
But has private sector implemented it?
That has been implemented.
Okay. So let's just go back. So it's about between 8,000 and 12,000 lions that's at stake. How many potential job losses are we talking about if government gets the satisfaction of having this implemented?
The figure comes back to us at about 3,400. That's the figure that we can ascertain at this moment. So it gets argued to say that it's not that many jobs. But 3,400 jobs in a rural economy is a lot. As many of the viewers out there will be aware, there was a lion task team last year that was tasked with identifying people to voluntary exit. They were established in December of 2022. By July 2023, they had only received one voluntary exit, and it was actually one of our members. And we had this discussion with the task team to say, you've cast this net to call for people to voluntary exit. Do you know that you've actually caught one of the best game ranchers that there is in the country? These individuals were awarded the Game Breed of the Year by WRSA a few years prior for their high standards and for their farming acumen that they've got. Now, what they were putting on the table was the following. They said they will donate their farm as a voluntary exit. The government's welcome to take it over, but kindly note that they want to purchase another property to invest in livestock farming with cattle, bonsmaras, at that stage. The irony came down, as soon as you remove the lion from their economic model, that entire farm is not viable. And the government was pushing this narrative of, no, we're going to give this farm for transformation. You're not going to be transforming anyone except into poverty if you're taking the key cornerstone species that is creating the wealth on that specific property. And it is also about our wildlife that attracts. What is South Africa's unique selling point? Is our wildlife. It's what attracts everyone to our country and promotes our tourism. So it will have a huge ripple impact on everyone, because you're going to remove the lions, but you're also going to create this feeling of, I'd rather disinvest from wildlife entirely, because what species next? Is it going to be my rhino? Is it going to be my elephant? Is it going to be my sable? Is it going to be my roan? What species next?
So, Richard, why would the South African government want to nationalize lions? Because it sounds like that's what they're doing.
I think it's just because they haven't got the capacity. To be blatant, I think it's because they don't have the capacity. Even if we have a look at the two gazettes. Now, the first gazette is a page long. The second gazette is 2.25 pages long. Now, we've got a strict law under NEMBA, which is the National Environmental Management of Biodiversities Act, 102B, which deals with public participation, that says a gazette should contain sufficient information, that sufficient decision making, either supporting or opposing this gazette, can be made by the public. How can I make any input when you're saying in your same gazette we still have to draw up an implementation plan? So you're asking me to give up my lions or give up my lion derivatives that are legally mine, that I comply with under permitting and legislation processes, that you should actually already as a government have records of, and as per your own management plan, you should have implemented a national database by 2019, have failed to do so. 5 years later, you're asking me to fill in what's as good as a jot form to say how many lion derivatives I've got, when you've issued me a permit for those derivatives and should actually be informed and have all the knowledge of that. And now you're saying, please put it on a database so that we can decide, and after the 120 days, we'll make a decision how we're going to handle the process. That's not sufficient information. No rancher, no farmer is going to make that decision without knowing, what is my exit point? Am I going to be compensated for this? Am I going to be put back in a position where I was? Because I've invested a large amount of economic revenue and income to develop this business. And when you develop a lion farm or a game ranch, your management plan has to show economic viability. Now, this is the part that I find absolutely absurd. Again, we're saying that we're not going to allow the commercial side that has to put a financial business plan on the table and showcase how it's going to be economically viable for the next 10 years to start up. But we're going to allow sanctuaries that are dependent on handouts and donations to be opened, that have got no business plan, have got no financial security, and have got no structure in place to say, we will be able to look after the welfare and the well-being of these lions for the next 10 years.
So do you see this as an onslaught on your members' right to partake in the economy as stipulated in the Freedom Charter?
So the Freedom Charter itself is maybe a little bit political. So let's not go there. But what we do see it as is this is a takeaway on our rights to sustainable use, on our rights to earn an income. South Africa is one of the few countries between South Africa and Namibia. Our 1991 Game Theft Act gave us ownership of wildlife, where if you put up a fence, you have the right to own that wildlife. And when we speak about wild, the term wild, what does wild mean? Wild for me means without the hand of man. Where in South Africa can you pinpoint on the map and show me one place without the hand of man that isn't being interfered with roads, cities, towns, power lines, that isn't fenced? Everything is fenced, even Kruger National Park. So when we're talking about our wildlife in South Africa, we've got a duty and a responsibility to management and to manage those species holistically and sustainably. And we're doing a fantastic job. South Africa's got now more wildlife than it's had for the last century. At the turn of the 1950s, we estimated that we sat with 500,000 head of wildlife in South Africa. We now have an excess of 20 million, of which 80%, 16 million, are in private ownership, and only 4 million is in state parks.
Richard, there's talks that the animals will be sterilized or maybe even euthanized. What will the impact of this be on lions going forward?
Again, it's a little bit of a conflicting report, that, because there's certain NGOs, and I'm going to be so bold as to name them, for instance, Four Paws, that in their latest report, which is South Africa's out of control big cat industry, is actually calling for euthanasia. But at the same time, they have a sanctuary called Lions Rock Big Cat Sanctuary in Bethlehem. So if you're calling for euthanasia, lead by example. Euthanize yours first. Don't call for me as the commercial sector to euthanize, but you yourself are not prepared to do it. At the same time, South Africa since 2000 has imported on our CITES trade database 580 live lions into the country. And most of these lions have been brought in from the zoos of Europe, where there's been devastation or issues or concerns. So what are we bringing them back to? To be euthanized. But we're using public funds and donation money to bring these lions because it's big business for a lot of the sanctuaries. At the same time, I'm going to pose the following question to you. In 2019, the two lion cubs, Carlos and Ivana, that the NSPCA rescued, those cubs were in deplorable condition. They should have been euthanized immediately. But what did it get turned into? It got turned into a commercial venture to raise funds and money for the NSPCA. Instead of the NSPCA doing their obliged legal requirement that they are ethically bound to do to consider the welfare of those animals, they profited from them. And that's where the big concern is going to come in. So my lions are up for the chopping block to be euthanized, but those in sanctuaries are not. And when I refer to my lions, I refer to my members. I myself have never benefited or owned a lion. So I've never financially benefited from lions, but I can understand what implication this has on the rural economy's businesses. And that's why I'll always champion for the rights of our members and for the rights to ownership, and to say, I have complied in all aspects herewith. I've got a permit, I've got a management plan, I've got an authorization from government to do business. Because government has failed me in doing its own mandatory protocols and developments that it should have done as per its own documentation, don't punish me, the farmer.
So, Richard, let me test the question on you. What is the difference between the right to own an animal like a lion versus owning a human being?
Okay, so we're trying to compare, if I understand your question correctly, we're trying to compare slavery to farming or ownership of a product. Okay, so let's answer it in the following way. How many animals have been farmed into extinction? How many animals that are currently being farmed are on the brink of extinction? In South Africa, we've got private ownership rights. We've now got more wildlife than what we've had for the last hundreds of years. Not a single wild species, including species like black rhino, in private ownership are facing extinction. 75% of the world's white rhino population is now found in private ownership. And it's because we're giving something value. Ownership takes responsibility. If you don't own it, then anyone can utilize it. Who's going to look after it? Who's going to plow into it for the future and say, I'm willing to put everything I've got into this lion and look after it because I've got an economic revenue in the future. If anyone sitting here in this room can come and take this lion away from me immediately, am I going to invest money into it? I'm going to invest my money somewhere else. So because we've got ownership in South Africa, we've got investment, we've got a growth in the wildlife economy, and we've got financial support that's been poured into it. The contributions and the economic contributions of the wildlife sector are in the billions, if not trillions, easily, and what we are doing. So take away that ownership and you cut that nest egg away. If we have a look at countries such as Kenya visited our country in 2021 to come and do an assessment of our model. We drove on a game farm and we saw a herd of 50-odd sable. And that entire vehicle erupted in chatter, and I couldn't quite figure out at the stage what was going on until someone told me, you've got more sable in front of us than we've got left in our entire country. According to their 2021 census, they've got 51 sable and 15 roan antelope left in the entire country. But that's a country where no one owns it. So if no one owns it, who's going to look after it? Who's going to take responsibility for that animal? And that's the difference. In South Africa, we've got a permitting system. We've got regulations that give us ownership. Take away that ownership, then it's a free-for-all. And that's going to be the biggest destruction to our wildlife economy.
Does government only want to take away private owners' right to own lions, or are they looking at other species as well?
At this stage, I think that's hard to answer. And the question comes in, are they really taking away our ownership if they're only taking away the commercial value? And that's where we've got to see what comes out in their decision making. But what needs to be said and said clearly is that a decision that's made needs to be made reasonably, based on fact, and have the evidence. If your evidence is in 2023 the first successful case of well-being being tried in the courts with lions, then is there really this welfare concern that we're trumping up in the media? Is it really there? And is a court going to allow you that has failed to implement all your policies and guidelines to now say, but I'm taking away your ownership rights because I can't do my duty? So as an industry, I think this is something that will be challenged. If it's not by us personally, it might be through one of the other associations such as SAPA or even individual lion farmers. And they've got a valid case to be made in saying that the decisions made are irrational and not in the benefit of the farmer.
And do you have any information that you're willing to share about the state of lions in the hands of government?
Well, that's a good question. So 80% of all lions tested in in Kruger National Park in the 1999 tested positive for bovine tuberculosis. So we're sitting with a population that's diseased. So does that mean that those lions can be relocated to the rest of South Africa? No, they can't. So our only wild population that's viable in terms of disease is Etosha. Secondly, if we have look a bit more south from Etosha at Madikwe Game Reserve, they've been euthanizing their lions on the quiet. I don't know if the general public's aware of that. So their managed lions are being euthanized, and I'll find the report for you, but basically in 2007, I think it was, they euthanized, can I find it for you quickly? In 2009. As an extreme examples of levels of culling in recent years, Madikwe Game Reserve culled its lion population down from 110 individuals in 2009 to just 40 individuals in 2012.
Sure.
So we talk about the captive lion industry being this issue for South Africa. But none of our lions are actually facing any form of threat. Why? Because we've got an active market. Take away an active market. And the prime example of this is during COVID, when you weren't allowed to buy cigarettes and alcohol. What did we all do? We went to the black market. Every single one of us is guilty of doing that. So if you take away this legal market, what are you leaving? You're leaving a black market. which is then going to put those lions in jeopardy.
So let's talk about poaching for a second. Is the poaching of lions an issue? Point number one. And then how does private sector's poaching efforts compare to government's efforts or to stop poaching?
Okay, let's talk about illicit trade. So illicit trade instead of poaching. Poaching in our reserves is not an issue at the moment, as it is with rhino. However, there is indiscriminate snaring that often causes death to lions, but nowhere close to have any impact on the species. In terms of the illicit trade market, a captive lion facility is a much easier target than a wild or a semi-wild managed lion population that you need to go find. So it's a lot easier to hone in on a captive lion population. So it's generally the captive lions that face the biggest poaching onslaught. Secondly, if we talk about illicit trade, everyone will go on about, but lion bones are being exported out of our country willy-nilly and no one's checking it. That's the one place where government actually did put policies in place that were exceptionally effective. During 2017 and 2018, when we had our last allocated lion bone quota, we exported 800 lion carcasses over that period per year. Of the 1,600 lions that were exported, only one was a tiger carcass, and it was caught twice on both methodologies. The one methodology being the actual weighing and appearance of the carcass, and the second one was DNA. So we don't have this big illicit trade that everyone's talking about. Another point that needs to be conveyed, everyone seems to think that lion bones are being farmed for tiger wine, to be replacing tiger wine. That's not the truth. 80% to 90% of the lion bones are used for trinkets and curios. What is wrong with using a byproduct of an animal to further its economic value to develop a curio? What is wrong with that? Are we now going to shut down all other forms of agriculture because we use the bones for bone meal, for example? Should we now shut it down? And that's one of the biggest challenges that we need to identify, is take away the emotion and have a look at the business. Are these animals really in such dire straits? Yes or no? My feeling is no.
Richard, what steps is Wildlife Ranching South Africa taking to prevent government's plans to continue as it is at the moment? And how can the general public join you in your efforts?
One of the first steps that we're taking is addressing the gazettes at hand by answering the questions, putting the facts in writing, and saying the decisions you're making are irrational. That's the process that we have to go through. It's a process that's laid out according to our legislation, and we'll continue to do so. Secondly, we are busy with our own implementation of self-administration to put things in place that allow us as an industry to calculate and show what we are worth and what we are doing. Because as discussed, the department has failed to put their systems in place. Now they're wanting to shut down our industry. So if we want to let our industry be shut down, we must sit back and do nothing. It's up to us to take ownership, to take responsibility, and to develop those systems and programs that government has failed to do, so that our membership can have traceability, can have accountability, and can justify the legal right to do business. In terms of the general public, please don't buy all the misinformation that is peddled out there. Ask the facts. Find out what people are really doing. Because in a large sense, emotion is what is being toyed with to generate wealth for a lot of these NGOs. And rather ask them, what are you doing with your lions? How many lions have you got? Where are they going to? How many tourists are coming through here? What is your financial statements for this property? And start getting the facts behind why are they making this decision to say, shut down an industry, but don't shut down my industry.
Thank you, Richard. That was Richard York. He's the CEO of Wildlife Ranching South Africa.